Governments will tax anything that moves, breathes, or occasionally sparkles in sunlight. 1. The British window tax in 1696. In late 17th century England, politicians decided that wealth could be measured by sunlight. So they created the window tax, charging homeowners for every pane of glass their house dared to have. The rich paid for views, the poor paid for darkness. People literally bricked up their windows to dodge the fee, turning whole neighborhoods into gloomy Lego sets of civic resentment. This absurd tax lasted for more than a century, inspiring the phrase daylight robbery. And it truly was. The government found a way to monetize sunshine. If you ever wondered why old British houses look like they were designed by vampires, it's because light used to be a luxury good. 2. The Russian beard tax, 1698. Peter the Great had one simple dream: modernize Russia by erasing everything that made it look medieval, including facial hair. He decided that the future was clean-shaven and charged every man with a beard a literal hair fee. If you insisted on keeping your glorious face forest, you had to carry a special coin proving you'd paid the tax. It read, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Imagine carrying government-issued beard money just to prove your chin wasn't a crime. Many Russians secretly kept their whiskers as a form of protest, the first recorded instance of facial hair as political rebellion. Somewhere in St. Petersburg, a man probably muttered, "I'll pay in stubble." 3. The American blueberry tax, 1977. Yes, in the land of freedom, they found a way to tax fruit happiness. In 1977, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched the Blueberry Promotion, Research, and Information Order. Translation: a federal blueberry tax. Every farmer growing more than 2,000 pounds had to pay a few cents per pound to fund blueberry propaganda, ads encouraging Americans to eat more blueberries. So basically, farmers were taxed to advertise their own crop. It's like forcing pizza makers to fund a campaign called "Have you tried pizza?" The irony? Most Americans didn't even know the tax existed. The government quietly turned breakfast muffins into a funding mechanism for berry marketing. Somewhere, a farmer stared at his tax bill thinking, "So, now my blueberries work for the government too." 4. The French salt tax, the gabelle. Nothing says government efficiency like turning basic human survival into a luxury item. In medieval France, salt wasn't just a condiment, it was a taxable event. The monarchy created la gabelle, a nationwide salt tax that charged citizens for daring to season their food or preserve anything edible. The worst part? Every region paid a different rate, so people started smuggling salt across provincial borders like it was powdered gold. Entire families became black market salt dealers, sneaking around at night with bags of sodium under their cloaks. The punishments were brutal: fines, imprisonment, even execution for salt crimes. Imagine dying because you wanted your soup to taste less like sadness. Eventually, the revolutionaries scrapped the tax, declaring salt free for everyone. Historians say it was one of the sparks that led to the French Revolution. You know your tax system's bad when people are ready to storm the Bastille over seasoning. 5. The U.S. cow flatulence tax. Proposal. In the late 2000s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency briefly floated an idea that made farmers across the nation moo in outrage, taxing livestock for their methane emissions. In plain English, charging cows for farting. The plan was to reduce greenhouse gases, but ranchers weren't exactly thrilled about filling out tax forms that basically read, number of cows, 47, number of toots, incalculable. They called it the cow tax, claiming it would bankrupt farms and turn rural America into one giant bean joke. Although the proposal never became law, it became political gold for decades, proof that bureaucracy could literally find a way to monetize burps. To this day, farmers still bring it up as a cautionary tale, the time the government nearly taxed the digestive process of a Holstein. 6. The Egyptian cooking oil tax. Ancient Egypt managed to build pyramids, but still found time to ruin breakfast. Pharaohs imposed a tax on cooking oil, but they didn't stop there. They outlawed people from making their own. You had to buy government-issued oil and pay the official tax on top. Inspectors roamed markets sniffing out contraband olive oil like culinary police. If caught frying your falafel with homemade oil, you faced fines or confiscation. It was the world's first mandatory brand loyalty program, sponsored by the state. People started reusing oil over and over until it could probably dissolve stone. The system was so corrupt that records show tax collectors were caught diluting oil with water just to boost profits. So if you've ever burned dinner because your oil was sketchy, you can thank a 3,000-year-old bureaucracy that literally turned cooking into a taxable privilege. 7. The Chinese brick tax, the Great Wall Edition. Leave it to ancient China to build one of the world's greatest wonders, and then bill its citizens brick by brick. During the construction of the Great Wall, local governments charged a brick tax, making citizens pay for the very materials they were forced to haul. Each household was expected to provide bricks, labor, or money, or all three. And if your bricks weren't regulation size, extra tax. The result was a bureaucratic nightmare where people were fined for crooked clay. Corrupt officials pocketed most of the money while peasants starved, watching their own taxes literally become the wall keeping them in. It's the ultimate metaphor for overtaxation. The people paid to build the barrier that kept them under control. Centuries later, economists still call it one of history's most impressive public works and one of its dumbest billing systems. 8. The UK hat tax, 1784. Because nothing screams financial innovation like taxing fashion, Britain once decided to charge people for wearing hats. Yes, hats. The tax was based on the number and quality of hats you owned, so the richer you looked, the more you paid. To enforce it, every legitimate hat had to bear a government-issued stamp inside the lining. Counterfeiting that stamp was punishable by death. So while the wealthy were getting fined for their fancy top hats, hat makers were getting executed for forgery. The poor, meanwhile, started wearing scarves just to avoid the fee. It got so ridiculous that people began sharing hats between friends to save money, creating what historians lovingly call hat pooling. The law eventually collapsed under its own stupidity, but not before proving one eternal truth. Give the British government enough time, and it will tax literally anything that casts a shadow. 9. The Danish cowhide tax. 17th century Denmark once managed to invent the world's least practical livestock tax. In the 1600s, the crown decided to tax cows not by number, but by how much hide they theoretically had. Yes, each animal was assessed like a leather couch. Officials actually measured the hides to calculate the fee, because apparently nothing says fiscal responsibility like chasing cattle with a ruler. Farmers quickly caught on and started breeding smaller cows, shaving down hides before inspection, and even claiming their cows were just really fluffy calves. Predictably, the tax devastated dairy production and nearly crashed the rural economy. By the time the crown realized that taxing animals by surface area was insane, Denmark had fewer cows, angrier farmers, and a national distrust of rulers, both the wooden kind and the royal kind. It's a perfect example of medieval economics. If it moves, tax it. If it doesn't, measure it anyway. 10. The American playing card tax, 1765. Before the Boston Tea Party, there was the Great Poker Rebellion. In 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act, taxing all printed goods in the colonies, including newspapers, licenses, and, bizarrely, playing cards. Every deck had to carry an official stamp proving the tax was paid, making poker night a matter of royal revenue. Colonists responded by smuggling untaxed decks and inventing their own freedom cards. Taverns became underground casinos of rebellion, where revolution brewed between rounds of gin rummy. The government thought they were taxing leisure. Instead, they funded the first wave of American defiance. By the time the Stamp Act was repealed, colonists weren't just angry about taxes, they were experts at cheating them. So, in a twisted way, the card tax helped teach America its earliest lessons in both independence and creative accounting. 11. The Indian soap tax. Colonial India had many absurd taxes, but the British soap tax was arguably the most ironic. In an empire obsessed with civilizing its subjects, officials decided to make hygiene a luxury good. Imported soap, mostly British-made, was taxed so heavily that ordinary citizens couldn't afford it. Missionaries preached cleanliness while the government profited from dirty hands. Locals began making soap substitutes from ash, clay, and herbs, launching an entire underground cleanliness movement. One nationalist activist even joked that nothing cleans the soul faster than untaxed soap. When independence finally came, Indian manufacturers proudly produced their own affordable soap brands as a symbol of freedom from imperial grime. The moral? If you try to tax people into cleanliness, don't be surprised when they wash their hands of your entire regime. 12. The English bachelor tax, 1695. In 17th century England, being single was considered not just lonely, but taxable. Parliament decided that unmarried men over 25 were shirking their duty to society and imposed a special bachelor tax. The idea was to encourage marriage and boost the birth rate, but it mostly encouraged sarcasm. Eligible bachelors started throwing tax dodger parties, wearing ribbons labeled "proudly untied." Meanwhile, widows were exempt, prompting rumors of strategic marriages lasting mere weeks. Tax collectors were forced to investigate romantic status, turning small towns into gossip factories. One clergyman complained that half his sermons were now marriage interrogations. The tax failed spectacularly. People still preferred loneliness over love enforced by the IRS. In the end, the British government learned a hard truth. Romance and revenue are terrible bedfellows. 13. The U.S. Cashiers Candy Tax, 2011, Illinois. America's sweet tooth met its bureaucratic match when Illinois introduced a candy tax with an especially confusing definition. Under the law, an item counted as candy only if it contained no flour. That meant Twix and Kit Kats, cookie-based bars, were not candy and taxed at a lower grocery rate, while Snickers, Skittles, and Hershey's were luxury goods. Gas stations became accidental legal battlegrounds, with clerks arguing over whether something crunched like a biscuit. One store owner hung a sign reading, "We sell taxable happiness." The absurdity reached peak comedy when state auditors had to inspect receipts for flour content. Critics called it the most half-baked law in America, and they weren't wrong. The candy tax proved that when government tries to legislate dessert, it ends up inventing a new food group, confusion. 14. The urine tax of ancient Rome. If there's one thing the Romans mastered besides empire building, it was monetizing human biology. Emperor Vespasian, ever the entrepreneur, noticed that public urinals in Rome produced a steady, unclaimed stream of profit, literally. So he taxed the collection of urine. The stuff was used for tanning leather, bleaching clothes, and even whitening teeth. Yes, really. So it was valuable. Collectors had to pay the empire for the privilege of gathering it. When his son Titus criticized the policy for being disgusting, Vespasian held up a gold coin and asked, "Does it smell?" The phrase pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, was born. The empire learned that bodily functions could fill imperial coffers, and the emperor proved that where there's waste, there's a way. Honestly, it's capitalism in its purest form, turning bathroom breaks into budget boosts. 15. The candle tax, England, 18th century. Imagine getting taxed just for wanting to see at night. In 1709, England introduced a tax on candles, making illumination a privilege of the wealthy. The law required not only payment per pound of wax, but also a license just to manufacture or sell candles. Anyone caught making them at home faced fines or imprisonment. Poor households sat in darkness, while smugglers lit up the black market, literally. Inspectors roamed villages, sniffing out illegal wax production like glow-in-the-dark detectives. The tax became so hated that people celebrated its repeal in 1831 by holding all-night vigils under the warm, glorious glow of untaxed light. The candle tax proved one timeless truth. If you try to charge people for seeing in the dark, eventually they'll light the torches and come for you. 16. The U.S. jukebox tax, 1940s. Back when diners ruled America and rock and roll was still innocent, the U.S. government decided to target joy itself. The jukebox tax placed a levy on every coin-operated music machine, treating them like gambling devices. Each diner or bar had to pay annual fees for every jukebox on the premises, as if Elvis himself were personally charging rent. Owners protested, arguing it punished local culture and teenage happiness. Still, the IRS persisted, claiming jukeboxes were luxuries, not necessities. In response, some small-town diners posted signs that read, "Music, courtesy of your overpriced government." Ironically, the tax only made jukeboxes more rebellious. Kids started sneaking in extra nickels just to stick it to the man, turning every soda-fueled sing-along into a tiny act of protest. Bureaucracy tried to silence rock and roll just turned the volume up. 17. The chimney tax, England, 1662. When King Charles II needed quick cash, he didn't tax land or income. He taxed air circulation. The chimney tax charged homeowners per fireplace, essentially punishing people for staying warm. It was wildly unpopular and nearly impossible to enforce, since citizens began bricking up chimneys or rerouting smoke through secret flues. Inspectors climbed rooftops, counting smoke columns like paranoid Santas. Some people even installed fake chimneys to confuse them. A whole national game of "Where's Waldo?" but with soot. Fires, unsurprisingly, skyrocketed because homes lacked ventilation. By the time Parliament repealed it in 1689, the nation had learned an important lesson. Don't make warmth illegal in a country famous for rain. The chimney tax remains one of history's coziest examples of government overreach, pun fully intended. 18. The Mexican door and window tax, 19th century. Inspired by Europe's worst ideas, Mexico briefly experimented with a tax on doors and windows. The logic was simple and stupid. More openings meant more wealth, so owners of big houses should pay more. The result? People sealed up their homes like tombs to avoid paying. Streets filled with dark, windowless facades that turned entire neighborhoods into airless prisons. One traveler wrote that Mexican cities looked like stone coffins with mail slots. The tax was so destructive to public health, causing outbreaks due to lack of ventilation, that it was quickly abolished. Ironically, the government ended up losing revenue because property values plummeted. It's the only time in history when closing a window could actually save your wallet. If darkness had a tax refund, this was it. 19. The hearth tax, England, 1662. The British monarchy never met a fireplace it didn't want to bill. Before the infamous chimney tax, England tried a hearth tax, charging citizens for every fireplace in their home. Officials went door to door counting hearths like medieval census takers with clipboards and soot stains. It was meant to be simple: more hearths, more wealth. But it quickly became chaos. People bricked up their fireplaces, forged fake walls, or started cooking outside just to dodge the tax. Inspectors had to crawl into homes, sometimes lifting floorboards to find hidden stoves. The public called it the tax on comfort and hated it so much it was repealed after just a few decades. The only thing it successfully heated was public outrage. Turns out, if you charge people for warmth in England, you're not taxing homes, you're taxing survival. 20. The wallpaper tax, Britain, 1712. If the government could tax taste, this would be the blueprint. Britain's 1712 wallpaper tax charged people not for paper itself, but for the designs printed on it. The more elaborate your pattern, the higher the rate. Florals? Expensive? Stripes? Still pricey? Just white walls? Free and soul-crushing. Aristocrats flaunted ornate walls like stock portfolios, while the poor had to stare at beige. Then came the revolution. Stenciling. People started buying plain paper and hand-painting their own patterns, creating a DIY movement centuries before Pinterest. Officials couldn't stop it, and by the 1830s, the wallpaper tax peeled off for good. Moral of the story? You can tax luxury, but you can't tax creativity, especially when people own paintbrushes. 21. The soap maker's tax, colonial America, 18th century. Back in the days before store shelves and brand jingles, making your own soap was a home necessity. So naturally, colonial governments decided to tax it. Every soap maker needed a license, and every batch was subject to inspection and fees. The idea was to ensure quality standards, but it mostly ensured the government got rich and everyone else got filthy. Families started washing with ash, lard, or even sand to avoid the tax. It was so universally despised that soap maker became a revolutionary job title, one associated with independence and defiance. When the tax was finally scrubbed from the books, people literally held cleanliness parades. It was a victory for hygiene, rebellion, and the basic right to lather without bureaucracy. 22. The coffin tax, Italy, 19th century. Death may be inevitable, but apparently, rest wasn't tax-free. In 1800s, Italy, several towns introduced a coffin tax, charging families for the privilege of burying loved ones in wood. Poorer citizens had to rent communal coffins, yes, rented, then remove the body before burial so the casket could be reused. The government framed it as economical recycling, which is a polite way of saying horrifying. Grieving families held midnight funerals to sneak past inspectors. Eventually, outrage forced the system to collapse, and the church publicly condemned it. The whole affair perfectly captured government greed. They'd already taxed life from cradle to coffin. So why stop there? 23. The shadow tax. Venice, 16th century. Venice, the floating city of elegance and paranoia, once taxed building extensions that cast shadows on public streets. The logic? If your balcony blocked sunlight, you owed money for stealing the city's light. Inspectors measured shadows with ropes and poles, charging extra if your architecture dared to be too proud. The policy led to hilariously stubby balconies and asymmetrical homes as builders tried to outwit sunlight. Artists even mocked it in paintings. Venetian life lived in the shade of bureaucracy. The tax eventually faded as absurdity eclipsed reason, but the message lingered. In Venice, even the sun paid rent. Humans will tax anything: light, air, hair, even dignity. Which one do you think deserves a refund from history?